Security and Emergency Preparedness Committee Secretary. She's an SRP fellow as well. Daniel is a developing inspector at the ONR within radiological protection and criticality specialism. He joined in 2019 and he's worked across emergency preparedness and response, HAS sources, transport, and IRR 17 compliance. Before that, he was a nuclear graduate, and he worked on secondments at Urenco and Hunterston B. I'll hand over to Nicola.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Could I ask a favour from somebody sitting near the door? Could someone just close it, because it'll keep the noise of the hand dryer out. Thank you very much. Okay. So Dan and I are going to talk to you today about sort of transport radiation risk assessments and the link between IRR 17 and the carriage of dangerous goods and use of transportable pressure equipment regulations 2009 as amended, which is quite a mouthful. So CDG from now on. And a Google search of radioactive material, car crash, vehicle crash, quickly highlights that it can and it does happen. It might not happen very often, but it does happen. And that the public really would rightly expect for anyone involved in the consignment that's run into trouble to know what to do and to be able to respond appropriately. So that's why this presentation about two very dry pieces of legislation is so important. And I just wanted us to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So I'm going to talk to you, excuse me, about why ONR are involved in regulating the transport of radioactive material, the regulations that we regulate against, point you to our guidance on regulating transport. Dan's going to talk about key issues we've found during the last sort of inspection program, the last 12 months, when doing our transport compliance inspections. And then I'm going to talk about an incident that happened not too long ago that was mentioned by the top speed presentation earlier today about a package lost on a quite a busy road. So why are we involved in the regulation of transport of radioactive material? And we're involved in the civil transport of radioactive material regulation for road, rail, and inland waterway. Not that anybody is currently transporting by inland waterway. And the pictures that you can see there are sort of my routine dog walk from home. And it's really sad to say that I got very excited a couple of months ago when I realised that I could see all of my transport diaries within a half-an-hour walk from home. The people at work were very, very disappointed that my life was so sad that made me so happy. But I can see all my diaries within half an hour of home. And that's Maple, the Labrador, who I now love after hating for the first year of her life, who accompanies me on the walk and was quite sort of disappointed to have to wait while I was trying to take these photos for this presentation. The Energy Act gave ONR the role of enforcing sort of civil transport of radioactive material by moving the carriage of dangerous CDG over to be a nuclear regulation under the Energy Act. And we're also the enforcing authority for IRR 17 for transport activities. So I've included quite a lot of information on this slide, but hopefully it's useful. And the whole point of the slide is really to get across that transport isn't carriage, which we find quite a lot. So CDG Reg 5 basically says follow ADR and RID. So it invokes ADR, the European Agreement for the Carriage of Dangerous Goods by Road, and RID, the European Regulation for the Carriage of Dangerous Goods by Rail. It brings that into UK law. And ADR and RID do use the term carriage, but makes it clear that carriage comprises all operations to do with transport, from design and sort of manufacture of packages through to maintenance, loading, unloading, in transit storage, carriage, all the way through. IRR 17 talks about carriage beginning when a package is loaded onto a conveyance and continues until it's unloaded from that conveyance. And the Health and Safety Enforcing Authority regs talks about the transport of radioactive material, beginning with preparatory processes such as packaging and continuing till it's unloaded at its destination. So it's just to bear in mind that we will look at transport activities which are not just carriage, we will look at the whole spectrum. So, as I've said, CDG Reg 5 basically says follow ADR and RID, and CDG as a whole adds a little extra for Class 7 dangerous goods, which are radioactive material, which brings requirements for radiation emergencies and notifiable events to ONR. So this is where it's hard to explain, so I'm going to try and get this message across simply, but it's not the easiest thing to follow. So CDG, Schedule 2, Part 1, Paragraph 2, refers back to the requirement for the duty holder to undertake a radiation risk assessment under IRR 17 for transport activities. So we're required anyway under IRR 17 Reg 8 to do our radiation risk assessment, but CDG makes a specific requirement for transport activities. And it then says that if your dose assessment as part of your radiation risk assessment results in significant doses, and that's deemed to be more than a millisievert in the year following an accident, then you can have a radiation emergency. And if you can have a radiation emergency, you must prepare a specific CDG emergency plan. And the paragraph 3 of the schedule, it's paragraph 3.5 A to J gives the specific information that must be included in that emergency plan. If you can't have a radiation emergency and you can't get above a millisievert for the transport activity you're undertaking, you don't need a CDG emergency plan, but you still need IRR 17 contingency plans. So it's just to say that it doesn't say you don't need emergency planning. It just means the outcome of your radiation risk assessment will tell you radiation emergency, yes, no. If it's yes, you need a CDG plan that also complies with IRR 17, Reg 13 contingency plans. And if you can't have a radiation emergency, then you need an IRR 17 contingency plan. Simple? Everyone got it? It's not the easiest thing, but it's important to start off with that understanding. So basically, it all starts with our beloved radiation risk assessments, and employers should ensure that they've prepared suitable radiation risk assessments for all aspects of transport, so going through from the preparatory to the carriage, etc., both in relation to normal transport operations and adverse transport events. And RPAs should ensure that they work with their transport duty holders to produce RRAs that meet IRR 17 requirements and also the management of health and safety at work requirements. And we've published guidance on our website earlier this year, which was revised guidance to try and highlight and clarify the areas that we've been seeing where we've had non-compliances in our transport inspections. So hopefully the guidance will be clear on the expectations that we have when we're looking at your transport radiation risk assessments. Saying that, and this is more for smaller duty holders, excuse me, especially the non-nuclear, it's vital that duty holders themselves understand the requirements, their legal requirements. Very often we go to inspections and they rely on RPAs and dangerous goods safety advisors. You're not duty holders, it is the duty holder themselves that need to be able to demonstrate to us how they're meeting their legal requirements. And it's also important for RPAs to work with DGSAs so that DGSAs are clear on what's being transported and they can give the right advice under CDG, ADR and RID for that particular transport. So going back to our Bible, everyone hopefully will be very familiar with ACOT L121 paragraph 70 and 71. ONR cannot force anyone to use the format that you see there for their radiation risk assessments. But I just want to highlight that during our inspections, that's what we are simply looking for, that you can demonstrate you have included all the matters that paragraph 70 require you to include that can inform the outcome that paragraph 71 requires. If you choose not to, and you have multiple documents that comprise your radiation risk assessment, then we very often will ask for a compliance matrix, because you may live and breathe your documentation system, your management system, but it's difficult for us to come in and to actually find out where everything is. So the message is it's simpler if you follow the format. It makes the regulator's life easier, but you don't have to. But you may be asked to produce a compliance matrix to aid understanding during the inspection. So what should a suitable and sufficient transport radiation risk assessment include? It should identify all reasonably foreseeable accidents. And just to remind us of paragraph 238 of L121, that's accidents that are less than likely, but realistically possible. So even if they're not probable, they're realistically possible, then you should identify those accidents. And our guidance then expects that accident dose assessment is made for the full range of accident scenarios that have been identified. And that should, what you need to hopefully bear in mind is that you're not looking at individual packages. We're looking for an assessment in your risk assessment of the consignments that you're making or the activity that you're undertaking, so that if the vehicle runs into trouble in sort of carriage, for instance, and you've got multiple packages, multiple types, it's what is the potential sort of estimate of dose for that vehicle running into trouble. So you can use, if you're carrying multiple things, bounding case or cases, to aid that, to make sure that you don't have to reassess for every single journey, etc. And our guidance points people to IAEA's median accident. So it's, you can have accidents that are less than that. You can have accidents that are worse than that will result in higher doses. But for a single type A package at the maximum allowable contents, which is the A2 value found in ADR and RID, and there's a background slide on the app for this presentation to explain that. At 1 metre at 30 minutes, IAEA estimate a 50 millisievert dose could be accrued. So our expectations when we are going on transport inspections is that if we see people are transporting more than a 50th of the A2 value, then we sort of start from the basis of we would expect to see DG emergency plan to be the conclusion of the radiation risk assessment, unless a robust justification is made. And that's fine, but it needs to be a robust justification. And we've included that to try and make clear our expectations. And different assumptions can be made for different kinds of packages. So type A packages are not designed to withstand accident conditions, but type B are, for instance. But we would expect that assumptions are documented with that justification that don't rely solely on package robustness. So we shouldn't be looking for, it's a type B package, it can't have an accident. There have been events that have happened with incorrectly maintained, etc. packages. And the RRA should make a clear conclusion on whether a radiation emergency for that package or bounding consignment, etc., or activity is or is not possible. And going on from that, a clear statement about the emergency arrangements that are required to be produced. So a CDG emergency plan that also meets IRR 17 requirements, or an IRR 17 contingency plan alone. So I'm just going to hand over to Dan now to take you through the findings of last year's compliance inspections.
Thanks, Nicola. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of the findings we made during the 2021-2022 financial year. Many of these relate to the radiation risk assessments and emergency planning, and probably reiterate a lot of what Nicola's told to you there. As I say, most of them do relate to the radiation risk assessments and emergency planning, specifically the few large first bars there, the first, second, fourth, and fifth in particular. So let's go through some of those then. By far and away, the most common issue we find is the radiation risk assessment not being suitable and sufficient. And this could mean, unfortunately, sometimes we find that the radiation risk assessment doesn't exist, which is quite unfortunate when that happens, but that doesn't happen, too frequently, thankfully. More often is the case that the radiation risk assessment hasn't considered all of the aspects of paragraphs 70 and 71. So what we do find is the duty holders will say, oh, it's not applicable, but we would like to see the, if those aspects aren't applicable, they should be stated so and why in the radiation risk assessment, not just, ignored. We also find often that the radiation risk assessment, it should be treated as a higher tier document from which the contingency plans and local rules and lower tier documents, the findings on the radiation risk assessment should flow into those documents. We find that often the duty holders will claim that a number of different documents make up the radiation risk assessment, and we found that often that makes it quite difficult for them to demonstrate compliance because all of the different dose constraints or investigation levels or what have you are all scattered across many different documents. One of the big issues we find is the use of generic templates, which have often been provided by RPA or an RPA body. And these often miss out specific duty holder information. So as I say, they're very generic. Sometimes they have things like on them, such as insert company name here, which isn't very good, isn't very helpful. But also they don't include just duty holder information, such as number of classified workers, doses, etc. These generic radiation risk assessments also often don't include specific information on what's actually being transported. So there's no information on sort of the number of packages, the radionuclides, the activities, the form of the package type, and the number of packages being transported. As mentioned earlier as well, by Nicola, transport isn't just the carriage, it also includes the packaging, loading and unloading. Often we find that the risk assessments don't consider these aspects, only the actual carriage itself. We've seen it assumed that those other aspects are dealt with by another part of the organisation, only then to find that they haven't considered that either. So if there's different parts of the organisation dealing with those different parts of the overall carriage, overall transport, we need to ensure that there's a joined up approach there. Often, other things we do find is missing, as I mentioned before, missing information on past doses. So of course, dose information is very important for dose management generally, and for determining whether dose has been reduced so far as reasonably practicable, or whether there's further control measures are necessary, or systems of work, or PPE. But often we find that these past doses mean it's quite difficult for the duty holders to set dose constraints under Regulation 9.4, and dose constraints being another thing that is often missed out from the radiation risk assessment. And similarly, those investigation levels under Regulation 9.8. These investigation levels we find are often set at a really high level. An appropriate level should be set at a level relevant to the doses actually being accrued. And often they're just simply set at the 15 millisievert maximum level, which is not appropriate. We often find that the duty holders think that we have a radiation risk assessment, therefore we're compliant, but it becomes clear that the radiation risk assessment isn't part of the management arrangements in any way. So, for example, it's not being appropriately updated or reviewed, and as I said before, it's not being adequately implemented. It's not flowing into the local rules, contingency plans, etc. So some of the things that we often find, a big one is an over-reliance on package type and package integrity that Nicola mentioned as well. Paragraph 70L of the approved code of practice and guidance specifically says that the impact of failures of control measures or failures of package or failures of systems of work needs to be considered when considering whether you can have a reasonably foreseeable accident. So essentially, it's not sufficient to simply say we have this package and it's robust and therefore we can't have a reasonably foreseeable accident. We need to consider, as Nicola said, the gentleman from Top Speed Couriers earlier today, showing that these things do and can happen, where packages may have not been correctly maintained or they've been incorrectly put together, or other things can happen. Paragraph 70K states you need to determine the level, the severity of the accident in terms of dose. An issue we find is the use, again, of generic terms, generic documents, this time talking about individuals. If there is an accident, individuals will be 1 meter away or behind some other kind of cordon. ONR guidance is actually that individuals responding, you need to calculate the doses for it to include the people actually responding to the event as well, which will obviously, in many cases, necessitate people being within the 1 meter cordon. And also, it's often assumed, as Nicola mentioned again, that there's only one package involved in the accident, where, again, ONR guidance states that we should be considering all of the packages in the consignment. And again, as mentioned, we see that if you calculate that the potential dose of over 1 millisieverts is possible, for a reasonably foreseeable accident, then you require a prescriptive CDG plan. But often we find there's no clear conclusion on it. So that has many implications on planning, of course, because if you haven't made such a conclusion, how do you know which kind of plan do you need? Do you need prescriptive CDG plan or IRR 17 contingency arrangements? And then again, that flows into testing as well. What plan are you testing? So I'm just going to hand back over to Nicola then, and she's going to talk about this recent transport incident.
So just a couple of final slides. Time flies. I thought this happened earlier this year, but it was actually September last year. So just to go through a package incident. So a Type A package, I think, as Dan said, Top Speed referred to this in their presentation, was found in the middle of a very busy road by a member of the public in September last year. And he was a very responsible member of the public. So he stopped, he picked it up. There was no information on the package apart from the consignor's information. So he phoned the consignor and said, I've got this package, what do you want me to do with it? And they asked initially if he would stay with the package and they would come and get it from him, but he needed to get to work, so that wasn't possible. And it seemed to be unbroken, no damage. So he was advised by the consignor to pop it in his car and drive to work, and they would meet him there. So he had no clue what he was carrying at all. When they got to his workplace, they confirmed that everything was intact. But I had a very, very uncomfortable conversation with the member of the public after the event to tell him that it actually did contain radioactive material, and was he concerned about that, and provide some reassurance. He was actually fine. And he because it was all sealed and intact, he said he was sure it was okay. And I'd said, well, it's a good job that it was intact, and it was probably okay even if it wasn't intact, because if it wasn't intact and it was broken, you wouldn't have gone near it. And that's when he said, no, if it was broken and smashed, I would have used my shoe to drag it across the road to get it out of the way of the traffic. So I'm like, interesting. So we obviously investigated, and we reviewed the likely dose that the member of the public had in transporting the package to work, because it wasn't carried in the rear of a vehicle, it was carried in the footwell of his car near to him, etc. Because even though Type A packages are one of the lower type packages, you can still have sort of significant dose rates and things. We also looked at the worst case, so what possibly could have happened if it was smashed and the containment was breached. We talked to everyone involved, and we undertook face-to-face inspections of both the carrier and the consignor, because at this point the carrier had no idea they'd lost anything. Apparently the locking mechanism at the back of the car had opened, the package had dropped out, and it had obviously shut again, so they were totally oblivious that anything had been dropped. And we followed our enforcement management model process, and it resulted in an enforcement letter to the carrier for failure to secure packages and failure to tell us of a notifiable event. Both carrier and consignors, if something goes wrong, both have duties under CDG to tell us that something's happened, even if it's double reporting, that the duty holders have both got the same responsibility to tell us, even of the same event. And the consignor had an improvement notice served for failure to carry out a suitable and sufficient radiation risk assessment for their transport activities. And they had an enforcement letter for failure to suitably mark and label packages. We did consider prohibition notices, improvement notices, higher level of enforcement for both of the sort of the duty holders in this case. But the carrier had completed 90% of the actions we would have required to rectify things. So it wasn't deemed appropriate to issue or proportionate to issue an improvement notice. The consignor, they'd taken action to verbally brief people and were retrospectively updating their procedures to make sure it didn't happen again. Because they were involved in medical treatment, we had to look at the sort of balancing the risk versus harm of stopping activities. So an improvement notice was deemed to be more proportionate in that instance rather than a prohibition notice. So it's just to say that it doesn't happen very often, but you know, it can happen. And when it does, we need to make sure things are as controlled as they can be to get things back to where they need to be as soon as possible. So Dan and I, in summary, have talked about why we get involved, ONR gets involved in the civil transport of radioactive material, the legislation we regulate against. We've pointed you to our radiation risk assessment transport guidance. And the second box down is we've also got emergency planning guidance for when you need to produce a CDG emergency plan. There's a very detailed guidance, and then there's a 5-step to emergency plan guidance, which is sort of a quick start for you to sort of have a look at. And hopefully you can see that the importance for learning from experience, etc., of notifying ONR when things go wrong. So there's also a link there for what we expect to be notified of for transport events. And there is more that we require notification about than simply when things actually do go wrong. You know, attempted theft and things like that are also part of our notification process. So it's important that that's included in emergency procedures. So it has been a very dry, there's not a lot apart from me dancing or singing, and I'm tone deaf to try and lighten and brighten this up. But I'd like to finish with a light-hearted message. I started out by saying that the public would expect duty holders to be prepared to respond to an event to make sure that everything was rectified if an accident did occur. And I'm sure they'd also expect for duty holders, transport duty holders, to be compliant with legislation. So again, I've got a very sad life. When Muse's latest single was released, which is called Compliance, it really, really rang true with me. And I'm just wondering whether it does with you. So I'm just going to play you a short clip. And I haven't got a prize, but if anyone can tell me the character and the film and why I associate him with compliance, then there might be a couple of CPD points if we can sort of twist SRP's arm. So I hope this works. Hang on. We just need your compliance. You will feel no pain anymore, no more defiance. We just need your compliance. Just give us your compliance. We won't let you feel lost anymore, no more self-reliance. It tickled me anyway, so don't feel pain, just comply is the message, and that's direct from Muse, so not from me or the public. Anyone know the character? Sorry, and the film? It's dating me now. It's aging me. Yes, and the character? Nope. Okay, Drill Sergeant Foley. So he had the job of turning raw new recruits into US naval aviation officers. If you Google him, it's very, very firm, very demanded compliance, went to extreme measures, but firm and fair. So hopefully I'll leave you with that ONR are aiming to be firm and fair, tongue in cheek there. You want me to sit down for questions for everybody?
Yeah, we'll.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Nicola and Dan. Okay, we've got plenty of time for questions. We'll go for ones from the floor, and then we'll see what's on the app. So microphone wielders, has anybody got a question? Please, will you just say who you'd like to address it to as well, obviously. I can see somebody in the row on my right-hand side, up the steps a bit.
Thank you.
Right, this is a question for Harry. Very interesting talk on safeguards. It's obviously a subject close to my heart as well from a small user point of view. I suppose a couple of questions really. One was, what's your, obviously just be your opinion, but when Trustfiniff declared themselves fuel-free, they obviously weren't. Yeah. So, I mean, do you believe that that was a correct decision made back in the late 90s when they removed all of the irradiated fuel from the site, but there was still fed, and there must have been some indication then that there would be some fuel there, rather than having you pick up the pieces when they start retrieving the stuff?
Yeah, so take that one first, John. Yeah, I suppose when they waved by, I'm trying to picture myself back then, being on the Trustfiniff site, they would have at some point waved by to the last fuel flask, and they probably genuinely thought, I would imagine, that they'd really got rid of it. Bearing in mind, some of you here will be more familiar with the de-splittering process where you generate this fed. Essentially, you squeeze the fragments through a die, and it's only probably now that we've got into the vaults and we've started rummaging around that we've realised the extent of it. I've had to mute the presentation down. I don't think I can actually say the kinds of quantities we found, but they are significant, for security reasons. I can't put figures on it. But yeah, possibly the perception back then was we'd have had contamination, dust, and that there are termination levels under safeguards. You may be familiar with homogeneous materials, so it might have been perceived, I think, that that the fed was a homogeneous material with just contamination in it. But what we've started finding, and it's only because we've been able to rummage through these vaults and actually take the fragments, isolate the fragments in a specially shielded container with a really sophisticated assay system, that we realise what we've got, and we've got some quite big chunks there, So yeah, people probably didn't really appreciate, how much they'd actually got. I would have thought, yeah, I would have thought.
Okay, thank you for that. And just one more, if I can. Accountancy and control plans. Obviously, these are relatively new, something that was devised when the new regs came in. What was your experience with those? You were obviously sort of putting that together for Trustfiniff. I've had to do the same for my company as well, and we're kind of starting from a, not entirely sure what we're supposed to be doing with with these documents, and what does a good ACP look like. I mean, was your experience with the regulator sort of, they were fairly helpful in, what you put together?
Yeah, so the way it works at Magnox, John, maybe slightly different to you, is, I mentioned on that organogram, we've got this central team, so we got the benefit of a head of profession, and they liaise directly with the regulator. Now, Magnox's solution was to come up with one ACP for the whole fleet. And the way we did that, it was quite generic, because, of course, all the processes we use are similar across all the sites, or the same, but we actually wrote a separate chapter for each station in the ACP. And in particular, we listed any deviations from the generic process. But yeah, it was quite a painful process for me, because there was a lot of work, an awful lot of work to do. And I do want to make that clear. It was a massive step change. We were under the impression that going from, your atom to ONR would be fairly seamless, but certainly it wasn't. And that was a pretty awful process, and an awful lot of work that we required. I think it aged the centre a lot more than us, because they were the ones that bore the brunt of it. And really, John, that would be one for them to answer. They did get quite a steer from the ONR. The feedback I had was the ONR wanted a lot, is the feedback the head of profession has given me. I think Magnox you know, what I understood was Magnox wanted the more streamlined approach, because bear in mind, we've got a basic technical characteristics document, and we have other documents, and it was felt that this could be, you know, another layer of complexity and just more paperwork, really. But yeah, my perception is that we did have to go to town on it, and it was quite a horrible job. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Harry. I'm gonna take this away from you now because I could be here all day.
Thank you. Spotted a question. Yeah, you beat me to it.
Thanks. One for Adam. If you throw enough money at it, you can always reduce discharges. So how does that feature in the OSPAR strategy? And you also mentioned in one of the earlier slides something about dose being a factor, but I've got an impression it's more about becquerels. So how does dose and value for money feature in that system?
Thank you. It's a good question. And so you're right, if you throw enough money, you can always reduce it. But in the strategy, there is still there taking account the technical feasibility, the radiological impact, and other legitimate uses of the sea, which you may argue is a media to dilute and disperse as well, to enable us to have low carbon electricity. So all those things should be taken into account. But there is a tendency for some people to say it's all about the becquerel, and there is this tension between maybe a desire to have a pristine environment, which we can't have because the concentrations in the environment is already contaminated, and even if we didn't discharge any more, it would be contaminated for a long time. And so I think there's a story to tell there, and to understand that. And the factors we just said need to be taken into account, and it's not always about spending more money, more technology, and we should be able to allow discharges, especially if they facilitate decommissioning, for example, because that might be for the greater good. So they need to be taken into account, and the provisions are there. It's just in practice, do we do it? And that's for every individual country and regulator to make sure they do.
Any more from the floor? Oh, yeah, spotted.
This one's for Adam. Do you think UK government's objective to expand the use of nuclear energy in the UK is at odds with the OSPAR strategy?
The short answer is no. I don't think it's at odds. I think there's sufficient flexibility in the strategy. As long as we're using BAT, then I think it's consistent. One of the interesting things that OSPAR is doing, which I didn't present today, is to use this it's called a DAPSIA approach, understanding the drivers and the activities that really result in the pressures to the environment. And one of the drivers is the need for energy and the need to mitigate climate change, and that those are recognized in there, and that those are legitimate drivers. So I think as long as we regulate discharges appropriately, nuclear power appropriately, I don't think it's inconsistent.
Okay, thank you.
Any more? Right, thanks everyone. We'll look at some of the app ones. We've got time for a couple of these. Nicola, most of them are addressed to you. I'll just pick some random ones. So who do you consider the RRA to be produced for? The regulator or the employer?
The employer, definitely.
That's good. Nice quick one.
Your risk assessment is there to say what the risk is and what you're going to do about it. We're coming to check that you're meeting sort of regulatory requirements. It's not for us, it's for you.
Okay, this is another one for you, Nicola. If the consigner is using a courier who may have multiple packages already on board, can you confirm that you only expect the consigner's risk assessment and emergency/contingency arrangements to consider their own packages and not the other packages that may already be on the vehicle.
Yeah, the carrier has a duty to do their own risk assessment for the consignments that they're carrying. So if they're carrying for multiple consignments, they would use the radiation risk assessments from multiple consigners to pull together their bounding case. And the consignors themselves would be producing the risk assessment for the packages they are delivering to the carrier. But it's all about cooperation of employers. So you need to work together to make sure that the emergency plans all dovetail together.
Thank you. Okay, that therefore is the end of our session. I have a little reminder here. If you're coming to the annual dinner, please book your seat on the app if you can. If you're not going any longer, then can you let someone from the organising team know, please? I think that just means they take the wine off the table, so maybe not say anything. And the pre-dinner drinks begin at 7 o'clock tonight. The dinner's at 7:30 in this venue, because a couple of people have asked where it was. And could we thank the speakers again, please? Well done.